All right. Hello, students from Rogers Adventist School. I have a special treat for you. You remember just a few weeks ago, well, maybe it was a month ago, we got to spend some time with your friend and mine, Dr. B. You remember his name is Robert Bartlett, but we got to call him Dr. B because that's what happens when you make friends with someone is you get to have a special nickname for them. And Dr. B shared with us all of the research that he had done on the triple nickels, and we got to see some videos and hear some of his stories. And if you guys remember, that day was a busy day because Dr. B met with K to 4, maybe K to 2. He met with 3 to 6. He met with the junior high kids and the high school kids. And so we didn't have enough time for the questions that you guys had. And so we said, hey, teachers, send us your questions. And then Mrs. Bryant will get together with Dr. B. We'll record answers to those questions, and then we'll save it and send it to you guys so you can watch it anytime. So that's what we get to do today is Dr. B has your questions in front of him, and he's going to take some time to share with us some of those answers so you can get all of your questions answered. Thanks for being here, Dr. B.
Well, thank you for having me. This is quite the treat to get to visit the same school and the same students, twice in a short amount of time. So again, thanks for having me back. So this is what I did with your questions, which they were all really good questions. And I'm going to try to answer them the best I can here. I broke them into, there's 3 different categories. There are 3 different separate blocks. Might be a little overlap. But the first block is my family, because you ask questions about my family, military history. The second is about the balloons themselves, the Fugos, the fire bombs, the codename paper, okay, and the balloon bombs. And then the third group of questions was about the triple nickel themselves, okay? So I put them in that order. So let me start with answering your questions concerning my family. So the question, how old was your dad when he started fighting in the military? My dad was born in 1921. Pearl Harbor was bombed December 7th, 1941. So that's 20 years, right, from when my father was born. My dad enlisted in the Army in 1942 at the age of 21. His older brother, Alfred, my uncle, was already in the Army by the time my dad joined. And so it was brother and brother. They were both trained and served as combat medics. You know what a combat medic is, right? They're the doctors assigned to the combat units. So they get to go and pull people to safety and then take care of them. And so both of them were trained and served in all Black units, because you remember that's the triple nickel story. We're talking about segregated military. They served in all Black units during the war as combat medics. Second question, was the picture of your parents, which I had a picture in my PowerPoint slide of my mom and dad. Dad was in uniform, taken on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked? No, it was taken after. My dad didn't enter the military, like I said, until 42, and the Pearl Harbor was bombed December 7th, 1941. So no, my dad was home on leave. He was in training in Michigan, and he was able to get home on leave. Was Dr. B in the military like my father? That was the question. Like his father. Yes, I was in the Army and fought in the Vietnam War. My brother, much like my father and his brother, was already in the Air Force when I joined the Army. He was stationed in Thailand during the Vietnam War while I was in Vietnam. So one of the things that they did, just a side note, during World War II, after so many brothers were lost in combat, being the only boys in some families, Later, they decided that was not a good idea to send siblings to the same war zone. So with my brother getting Thailand, I got short straw, I guess, Vietnam. But he was involved in the war in Thailand as Air Force, and I was in Vietnam. So my father and his brother were World War II, and my brother and I served basically together, but not together in Vietnam. I was Army, he was Air Force. Do you have any stories? Another question. Do you have any stories about what your dad slash uncle did in World War II? So yes, they were combat medics. They never. I also had other uncles-in-law married to my father's sister, and other relatives that all went into the army at the same time in 1942. All these black men went into all black units because again, the military was segregated. Um, Not a one of them, although they all served heroically. And my one uncle, as a matter of fact, who was married to my father's sister, Dorothy, was severely wounded in a battle in Germany and came back a disabled veteran who he lived near us. But none of these men in the family ever told war stories. They just never. But here's the interesting thing. They never told combat stories, but they did talk about, and this was really at the heart of the story I told you before, they did talk about the horrible treatment that they received because of the racism of the time in the country. Here are these men in uniform, training to go off to war, having to sit in the back of the bus because that was the law, having to drink out of separate water fountains, having not being welcomed into military clubs on base where they could go in and have a beer or drink. They weren't welcome there unless they had a separate one for the black troops or a separate facility. But if there was only one, it was for whites only. They couldn't go there. They did talk about that. They did talk about how horrible it was, and if you study that history, you find that there were a lot of servicemen who went to prison because they said, I'm not doing it. I'm in uniform. I'm a soldier. I want to fight for my country, and they stood up for that bad treatment they were receiving, only to end up in prison. Some ended up, unfortunately, dead because of their resistance. Okay, so no, they never told war stories. Sadly enough, their stories were about the shameful treatment that they received both before the army, during military training on military bases, and even when they returned from the war and not being able to benefit from the GI Bill, which was what was given to veterans and still is, to help them get started, or low interest loans to buy a house, those sorts of things, or even able to join the Veterans of Foreign Wars organization in town. That was a civilian organization, of course, for veterans, and my relatives wanted to join, and I said, no, start your own. So they started their own Black Veterans Affairs. So it was a very very, very shameful time in history, and that's what they told stories about, which you would think that wouldn't be the case, but it was very much the case. So they told stories of blatant racism and how horribly they were treated, and so did the Triple Nickel. By the way, I could have gone into a lot of stories that these men told of how they were treated in Pendleton, and unfortunately how they were treated in Walla Walla, how they were treated in Chico, California, how they were treated in Montana as they were doing their job, as military. Let's see. One student has a grandma named Elena Bartlett and wonders if you are related. Well, maybe. If your relative is from Virginia or West Virginia, there is a possibility that we are Well, we we have to define what you mean by related. If you're talking about blood related, likely not, because the Bartlett name, which is the case for the overwhelming majority of African Americans in this country, Black folks in this country, our names are not our names. We took our names, or our ancestors took the names of those who owned them. And so their last names, which is why a lot of Black people in this country have the last name Roosevelt, um, or Washington, um, even Lincoln, because they took the names of presidents, or they took the names of literally the people who owned them. So if we talk about related in loose terms, it's a possibility. But if we're talking about blood related, chances are very slim. But that's a good question. A lot of Bartletts out there. Okay, so that's the family questions. Balloons. Who invented the balloons? Okay, well, if you remember, the balloons that we're talking about, not the kind you buy at a store, right? These balloons were 33 feet in diameter, which is bigger than the room I'm sitting in right now, my house, filled with hydrogen gas. And they were built by the Japanese military in Japan. And they were a work of genius. It was mind-blowing and mind-boggling to our military to begin to discover these things and look at the technology and the elaborate way these things worked. I mean, it was like, it was amazing what they how they worked and how they were built. They were built with paper. The skin was paper, and that's a whole story you can go into. Matter of fact, let me just mention right now, there's a documentary, and let me check real quick on my shelf. I'm not sure I have a copy. Okay, I don't. But there's a wonderful film, a documentary that was done a long time ago by the title Paper Wings, and it goes into depth on these balloon bombs. But if you just simply Google balloon bombs, Japanese balloon bombs, World War II, or Fugos, Fugo, it just, in YouTube, it'll just flood you with shorts and longs into the detail construction of these things and their history and development. So yeah, I'm going to let you go ahead and do that research. But let me just basically, the Japanese developed these. School children were recruited to make them because they could make the paste, and the children didn't know what they were making. They weren't told what they were making. They just said it's for the good of the war. Okay. So they got to make this paste and paper these strips, paste these strips of paper together, and they eventually created these big balloons. And then they filled them with hydrogen gas, and then below the balloon was a basket. Like you've seen balloons floating, and people take rides in air balloons. I'm sure they do that down in Walla Walla. They do it up here. They do it everywhere. It's wonderful. My wife and I gave her a ride for her 60th birthday, I think it was, but here in Spokane. But anyway, there's a basket below this huge balloon that had sandbags around the top. Inside, it had a barometer, which you'll have to look that up or have your teachers explain to you what a barometer is, and an altimeter, which tells you your distance from the ground. And sandbags circled this basket. And then below that were these bombs. They had either two bombs, regular bombs that would blow up, or they had one bomb, and then they had fire bombs around the outside. So the Japanese developed this as a secret weapon, and the reason they figured out how this was going to work, or theorized how this was going to work is because they also discovered the jet stream, the Pacific jet stream, which is a column of air that is always flowing from across the Pacific. And this jet stream will carry things in it over 100 miles an hour. But it's not, so your ground is here, right? And then you have air, and then you have your normal air circulation, but the jet stream is above that. So they discovered it. No one else knew about it, had ever thought about this jet stream, and they figured it out. And so they designed these balloons, which I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll get back to that. These balloons, they would fill them with hydrogen gas. They had the bombs all underneath, all set up, and they set the firing mechanism. And then these balloons would go up into the jet stream and then take off across the Pacific, all the way across the Pacific. Now, they couldn't steer them. There was no one in them, and there was no way to guide them. You just depended on the wind to take them. And they had it all mathematically calculated out, which is why we need to study math, because they cracked the code. They said, okay, going at such a speed for so long, given the distance from this particular place in Japan to the United States, and when the balloons would start to, during the heat of the day, the sun would add to the expansion of the balloons and keep them up. But as the air cooled, the balloons would start to drop. And so this barometer and altimeter was designed so that when the balloon reached a certain low altitude, a trigger would fire and drop 2 sandbags. And then the balloon would climb back up again. And then it would sail a little bit further. And then when it started to, in the evening, when the air would cool, no sun, they would start to drop, and then bang, and these sandbags would fall off, and it would keep going. It was genius. I mean, it's a weapon, and that's bad. But the idea that they figured all this out and did the engineering is amazing. And so the balloons were designed, engineered, assembled in this little town on the coast of Japan during the war. Started in 1944, and they started launching these things. Okay, let's see. So I think I answered the second question. How did the sandbags fall off? I just tried to explain that to you as briefly as I could. They had all that fancy stuff. When the last sandbag dropped, then there was nothing to keep the balloon, as the air cooled, the balloon would slowly lower, and then another mechanism would drop this bomb. And then it was designed so that when these fire bombs finally hit, they would, of course, start fires wherever they landed. Now, if you remember, I believe I told everyone the same story of the family in Bly, Oregon. The minister and his wife, who was pregnant with their first child, took 5 kids from church on a picnic. And while the father was parking the car, the wife and the children got out to find a place to play. And there was a bomb laying on the ground, and they didn't know what it was. They'd never seen anything like it before. And the kids, unfortunately, touched it, and it exploded, and their lives were lost. There were other incidences where balloons were found by the military. They were found all over the West Coast. The Japanese plan was to burn the entire West Coast of the United States, thus causing us to change directions in the war, right? Oh my gosh, we need to focus on, we're getting hit by these silent, and they make no noise, right? Like a plane, you could hear, but these, no, were very silent and very deadly. And a balloon I mentioned to you landed in Hanford and got tangled in the fuse wires when they were making plutonium. Well, if it would have skipped just a little bit further before the last sandbag, right, and dropped in the main part of Hanford, it would have been horrible. There wouldn't be a Pasco, Kennewick, or Richland, and no Hanford, because it would have caused a big chain reaction of nuclear, strength. So let's see. Did they, meaning the military or anyone, find a way to intercept the balloons before they reached the US? Well, as a matter of fact, there was a command center in Seattle, Washington, called Silver Lake. And Silver Lake was a dispatch center. And so when balloons were spotted, because see, the military knew about this before the public did, and that's another question. The military knew, but they wanted to keep it quiet. They wanted to keep it a secret. And so calls would come in for an object over the Pacific. They would be spotted by military planes. They'd be spotted by ships out at sea. They would be spotted by people in Seattle and people all along right here where we live. And I'm sure there's a balloon likely around Walla Walla somewhere, if not more than one. Or people remember seeing them, but they'd have to be really old, way older than I am. They have to be in their late 90s, right? But but anyhow, they once the balloon was spotted by the military or the Forest Service or whoever, they would call in to Silver Lake, balloon spotted, here's the coordinates. And then from that place, they would scramble fighter planes, or they would tell a ship that had anti-aircraft guns on it about it, and they would shoot them down, or they would try to shoot them down. Usually they were successful because these things are moving really slow at that point, and they're big, and they're not shooting back, you know. But the military would shoot them down. Now, if they were over the United States, they were less reluctant. They were reluctant to do that because now you got bullets flying into the sky that have to come down somewhere. And then once you do that, it's going to fall, and you can't control necessarily where. So what they usually would do in that case is they would send up a spotter plane, scramble again, and the code name was Paper. Paper, because this was a secret. Paper spotted, da 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 da, scramble a spotter. The spotter would go up and follow, and then try to determine where it was going to finally come down. And then they would send in the military. They'd send in the triple nickel. They would send in the nearest unit, you know. So yes, they did try to shoot them down, and they were successful. But if you remember, I showed a map of all of the spots where balloons have fallen, and the Northwest was literally, well, all the way down the coast looked like a bad case of the measles or something. There were just red dots, remember, everywhere. Those where balloons are actually found, all the way up to Canada, all the way down to Mexico, all the way across the United States to Iowa, all the way across to Michigan, down in Boise. Balloons were landing all over. Okay, so that's how good this technology was. But again, they would send them up and had no control. They were just hoping they would land somewhere, and it would cause significant damage. Now, just like so many bombs, even to this day, they don't all go off. And so, in spite of all this technology, all this elaborate design, many of the balloons, many of the bombs never exploded. So what they find still, and this is jumping ahead, but they find pieces of the balloon, the metal parts still, and in some cases have actually found a bomb stuck in the ground, covered with matter of soil, you know, that's just over the years, snowpack and mud and such covers these bombs. So what they tell, and I'm telling you this, if you're ever out in the woods and you see something, metal ring that looks really weird, or something that you just can't identify, don't mess with it. Call someone and have them retrieve it. I received a call last year from a woman up in Newport, Washington, just north of here. And she said, Bob, I think I found something. I'm like, what do you mean you found something? I didn't know her. She got my number because I did a presentation on the triple nickel up in Sandpoint. And I said, well, send me pictures. Well, she was digging up her garden, and clunk, hits metal with her shovel, and she uncovered a bomb. So they're out there still. So we need to be careful, and definitely don't play with them. Don't touch them. Stay away and call someone. So let's see. So they did intercept them, and there's balloon parts scattered all over, and they're also in places where we haven't been. You know, there's a lot of this country we've never walked on out here in the Pacific Northwest. There's wilderness areas. The reason they're being found now is because so many trails are open in wilderness areas and a lot more backpackers and people in the woods and Forest Service people out cutting timber or working a job or whatever. They're the ones that find them because they're out there all the time. But it's like a needle in the haystack, right? That old saying, like looking for a needle in the haystack. Because, I mean, look out your back door, look at the Blue Mountains and just imagine a balloon in there somewhere. You may never see it. We don't. So let's see. When did they finally tell the public about the balloon bombs? Well, once the family was killed in Bly and the military came in and silenced everybody, pulled the press, said, nope, nope. It eventually leaked. The stories leaked because these bombs were falling in Kalispell, Montana, Missoula, Montana, even near here, near Spokane. And people are like, this isn't right, you know, but they try to swoop in the military and gather everything up and silence the newspapers and say you didn't see anything, but it didn't work. So by 1945, by the time the Triple Nickel actually were being sent out here to do this, they had not heard of it. They didn't know what they were going to be doing, but the word was out that there were these balloon bombs being found and starting fires and such, and causing damage. So they started sending them in 44. It wasn't until 45. Now, here's the interesting question that one of you asked. Let's see. Why did our government keep them a secret? Wow. Two main reasons. One, they did not want the American people at that time to panic that they were being bombed by a foreign country and that they were being bombed silently. Can you imagine? You know, people would then stay up all night looking outside, staring at the sky, and any foreign object in the sky. Sometimes they were weather balloons launched by the weather stations, but they were big round things flying in the sky, and they'd call it in, and so they decided the best option was to keep it a secret because they did not want the American people to freak out that they were being bombed, and it was working. The second reason was that they did not want the Japanese to know that they were successful. They figured if they kept the story a secret, the word would never get back to Japan that anything happened. That they were launching all these balloons, thousands of them. And as long as they kept things quiet, secret, then they would give up. They'd be like, oh, not working. So the two main reasons, they didn't want the American people to panic, and they didn't want the Japanese to know. So again, here they have 300 black soldiers, airborne, trained and ready to go to war. But the military didn't want them. So, okay, we have a job for you. And that's how the Triple Nickel got involved in this. It was a classified mission, secret mission. They had no idea that they were going to fight forest fires, no idea that they were going to get cross-trained to disassemble fire bombs. So that's how secret it was, okay? But the story eventually leaked. Number 6 question in this list, did the US retaliate against Japan for the bombs? Now, this is a fascinating story. First of all, the American government, the military are like, where in the heck are these things coming from? They had no idea. So they started guessing. And they originally thought they were coming from the west coast of the United States, that there was some secret operative group in the United States that was making these things and launching them. And I mean, how else could they get here? They had no idea originally that they were coming on the jet stream and that they were coming from Japan. So the military and professors, researchers got together and disassembled these balloons when they could find the fragments, right, pieces. And the most unlikely thing happened. I would have never thought of this. Someone decided to check the sand in the bags, in the sandbags, because the bags had to be filled somewhere. So another interesting thing is sand. You know what sand is? A sandy beach. You've been out on the sandy beach. Sand tells a story. Sand doesn't just appear there. It gets created by runoff. And so the sand consists of rocks that are there surrounding, that are in the flow of ice and water, pushing these rocks over time, and they tumble and they eventually become particles of sand. And so they opened these sandbags and actually started studying the composition of a sampling of the sand. And they found interesting things. So not only did they find um, well, what would the word be? The remnants of life of shells from living creatures, that were ancient in the sand. They found that these were distinct to a certain region of the world, and that the sand composed of rocks that were unique to a certain place in Japan. I mean, this sounds like a science fiction, right? This sounds like a science fiction story, but it's not. It's a true story. They kept sampling and sampling the sand, and they go, wait a minute, no, it's not from here. These shells are not from here. But they had to look under a microscope. This stuff is very microscopic, right? And they're studying, and they test these little granulars of sand, and they go, no. So they go all the way back, and they find the beach and the city on the coast of Japan. And they send spotter planes who confirm that not only is the place where the sand is, but it's also, they had these helium factories. They have to make the helium someplace, and they found these helium plants in this small little town on the coast. So then they did B-29 raids, bombers. Those are American military bombers. Flew these incredibly dangerous missions and bombed these hydrogen plants. That's a helium, not hydrogen. They bombed these hydrogen plants, and that stopped production. They had no hydrogen. They had plenty of sand. They could make the paper, but without the hydrogen, they were useless. So isn't that something? That tells you, for some of us, when we get in the science class, we say, well, we don't want to study this. When would I ever use this? Well, thank goodness someone was paying attention, and they said, let's look at the sand. They're like, no, you don't need to look at the sand, you silly duck. They go, no. So there you go. I mean, crazy, huh? Crazy. Okay, so yes, the United States did retaliate in a big way, unfortunately. Unfortunately for them, because once it was found out, they leveled the whole place, thus knocking out production. Have any of the balloon bombs been found recently? What is that game that some young people were playing? It was very popular. Pokemon, no, where you go find things.
Yeah, like Pokemon Go.
There you go. That's it. Yeah, I was almost there. Believe it or not, some people found a balloon playing in a Pokemon Go game. It wasn't the intended find, but they found recently. So that was popular, what, a couple years ago, maybe, or longer. Balloons are still being found. Now, I haven't heard of one being found recently. But as summer approaches and more people get outside, we're likely to hear that someone, found something somewhere that they don't, now a lot of us are what do you call it? Souvenir seekers, right? So I can imagine that there are people that did find stuff, didn't know what it was, and they just kept it. I mean, it's in their garage or in their basement, and they don't know what they have. Hopefully they don't have the bomb part. They have like the fins of the bombs and different parts of the balloon, the basket. The paper's disintegrated over time, but the lines that they were tied with are likely gone. But the metal frame that the firing mechanism sat on, altimeter, barometer, excuse me, those would be intact, and any metal of the bomb. Okay, let's see. And last question in that category, or that was, have any of the balloons been found recently? Okay. Now, the third category and the final one is all about the triple nickel. So, question. If the 555th had not stopped the fires, what would have happened? Good question. Like any fire, you never know what's going to happen. For example, you have a house in a neighborhood that catches fire. Fire department comes. Well, they not only are working on your house or the house that's on fire, they're trying to protect the other houses next door. And so they're spraying with water. They're watching carefully where sparks are flying, and they're trying to put those out. Well, fires are no different. When they start in the woods, whether it's lightning or a campfire or a bomb or whatever, they're very unpredictable because winds kick up and fires spread quickly, especially if there's a lot of fuel. We're about to go into what might be the worst fire season we've had in a while, just because it's been so dry. And the hard part about our weather is that if we get a lot of spring rain, the grass grows quickly and then it dries out, and we don't get any more moisture. And then that grass dries out. It becomes very volatile, and trees and everything else. So if they were not there to put out fires, they would have burned countless acres. And trees are valuable. I mean, not only are they valuable for us to live on this planet because of the good work they do, they're also valuable because we build our homes with the lumber. They're a resource and there's economic value. And so you want to, whenever there's a forest fire, you want to get there as quickly as possible and put it out. The other thing is eventually they could put lives at risk, right? They burned enough and they got too hot and too out of control. You're in trouble. The winds are just right. Well, look at California last year, how devastated that state was with forest fires. And they start out in the wilderness, they start out in the woods, but the winds and the temperature and dry conditions, thousands of homes have been lost in California, and lives, hundreds of lives have been lost. So what would have happened? Well, we can only guess what would happen, right? I mean, bad would happen. So they were sent to stop further damage. So whenever there was even the slightest puff of smoke in the woods, they didn't care whether it was a campfire or a balloon bomb. The triple nickel were sent. Like, we don't want to risk civilians on this. The men were trained how to disarm them. Oh, by the way, there was a question there, and I don't know if I must have skipped it, but I do remember seeing it. Did they ever find, did the triple nickel ever find bombs? And there's only one account that I can find where they actually found one that hadn't blown up, and they destroyed it rather than try to disarm it, because that's a little tricky. Timing and one little false move and things would turn out badly. So they would typically destroy them when and if they did find one. So they did, but usually there was nothing left by the time they were there because of the fire that they created and just burned everything but little pieces of metal. So yes, these fires would have continued to burn, and valuable timber would have been lost, and lives could have easily been lost. Did this group, oh, there's the question, did this group ever find an unexploded bomb? And yes, but only one is recorded being found, and that is the whole thing, the whole assembly being found by these guys. Number 10, what new skills did the group have to learn about smoke jumping, the triple nickel, what they had to learn? Well, this is a story in and of itself, but I'll just cut to the chase here. So the triple nickel guys showed up in Pendleton, not knowing what their assignment was, but they quickly realized they were not going anywhere else. they that Pendleton and Chico, California, was going to be their assigned duty station until the end of the war. And that was not met very positively at first, but because they were, never mind, that's another question. So here they met. The first people they meet are Forest Service, and they're thinking, wait a minute, we're Army, they're Forest Service, why are they talking to us? And that's when they opened their orders for the very first time and saw the order, the two things on the order. And all of a sudden they realized, uh-oh, this is going to be different. But their assignment was to find and destroy balloon bombs and to fight forest fires. So I was like, oh. So the first thing they then did was turn in all of their military stuff, all of their war stuff, their guns and their helmets and all the stuff that they would have taken into a war type situation. And the Forest Service issued them shovels, picks, shovels, double-bladed axes, the tools of fighting forest fires, which are very different than you would take into a war zone. They were given these tools. So that was a huge thing. Like, wait a minute, what? Okay, these things are going away and you're giving us this stuff. All right. So the cross training started. So they had to learn how to read Forest Service maps, which are different than military maps. They had to learn how to use these tools, pickaxes and stuff. They had to learn how to build trenches that would stop, to build a fire line to keep the fires from spreading. There's a whole science about fighting fires, and these were like, wow, we don't know. So the Forest Service had to give them this crash course, figuratively speaking, crash course in how to do the job of fighting forest fires. And they had to learn new equipment, they had to learn new maps. The pilots were all Army pilots. They weren't trained as smoke jumper pilots, which is different. It's not you just fly a plane and tell people to get out. Okay, there's the fire, get out. There's a whole approach to sending out people to fight a forest fire than sending out troops to go to battle. They also then had to learn a new parachute. The parachute, and I believe I showed you, but I happen to have one. Did I show you? Do you remember, Principal Holly? You do? You remember the parachute? Did I?
Well, I think one of the groups you showed them a portion. I don't think
Okay, well, it's right over here. Let me grab it. Okay, hold on. So this was the military parachute, parachutes in here, that they were trained to use. And it's called a T7 parachute. However, the Forest Service jumped a parachute called the Deary slotted chute, Derry. And the reason is because to smoke jump, you need to have a lot of maneuverability. You need to pick your landing spot carefully because there's a fire. But you need to have more control of your parachute, which means you're also falling at a slower rate of speed. This military chute was designed to get you from the plane to the ground as quickly as possible, with very little room to steer. Because once you got to the ground in this parachute, you were engaging the enemy in battle. So this was a throwaway item. You got out of it as quickly as possible and got into got into battle. But for smoke jumpers, they needed a parachute that, first of all, they could use over and over again. And they had to learn how to repack them, take care of them, take them out of the woods. They had to retrieve them from trees. And the military didn't have that training. So then they took this parachute, this T7, it's actually written on the side, and they sent it to a factory to be modified to be a Deary slotted parachute. And it's printed right on the side. This is an actual parachute that was used in Pendleton, Oregon by a member of the Triple Nickel. So they think of it this way: you train in a certain parachute and you learn that parachute, and it's the one you jump during training, and then you get your new assignment and they hand you a different parachute. And they say, now we're going to teach you to use a different. It's mind-boggling to think about what these men had to do. So they had to learn to jump a different parachute. They also had to learn to something else that was totally foreign to them, and it caused a lot of difficulties, to be honest. They were taught how to and when to land in trees. The military, you don't want to be in a tree. First of all, you're being shot at when you're in the airplane. You're being shot at as you fall from the sky under a parachute. And if you get hung up in a tree or in a building on something, that's not good. But in smoke jumping, trees are actually can be the most desirable place to land on purpose. And they're like, this makes no sense, right? I mean, would you come on? No, we want to avoid trees. Their training was all about you find a big open space, flat ground, and that's where your drop zone is, right? And they're saying, no, in the mountains of the Northwest, a flat space may look flat from the air, but by the time you get there, you can see all this grass and stuff. It could be a boulder field. So smoke jumpers deliberately at times, unless they have intel on the ground, steer to a tree because they're trained in what they call letdown procedures because they were issued ropes. They'd never been issued a rope before because they never were trained to let themselves down using a rope. So this was one of the things that really affected their performance because they ended up getting a lot of injuries because instinctually they want to shoot for the open space in spite of being told not to, because a tree is just not what you want to do. And this whole letdown thing with ropes, and you got to know how to tie these knots. And so these men had to learn a lot. And you know how long they were trained? 2 weeks. 2 weeks. They were trained all of this Forest Service stuff. And the pilots were trained 2 weeks. And they did some practice jumps around Pendleton and Chico. They practiced near Walla Walla. And then they left and they say, here you go, do your job. It was not an easy transition. It was, and unfortunately there were several accidents because the men were not quite, well, they weren't thoroughly trained. A smoke jumper trains for months, not 2 weeks. Okay, let me see. New skills. So they learned a lot of new skills. I could have just said that, but I wanted to show you just an example of some of the, here's a new parachute kind of thing. And if it were me, I'd be like, I think I'll stick to the one I know. I feel safer that way. Okay. Did any soldiers earn medals? Well, the members of the Triple Nickel received what they call accommodation letters from their commanding officers when they acted in some heroic fashion. But the Triple Nickels themselves did not receive medals about their fire duty. However, once the war was over and they were done with their mission, which went on after the war was over, but they were still fighting fires because there were still fires to be fought into October of 45. Once that was done, though, they were sent back east to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And there they eventually were assigned to General Gavin, who was the commander of the 82nd Airborne in Europe during World War II. He was the youngest general in the military at that time. But anyhow, he was the commander of the airborne in Europe. And the 82nd took a lot of casualties, and they were awarded a lot of accommodation medals, medals of all kinds for their heroic action in World War II. Well, General Gavin heard about these triple nickel guys, and he said, you guys acted very heroically doing a mission that you were not trained to do. He was truly moved deep in his soul by their story, and he felt badly that they were treated so badly. And he's a white guy, right? But he's like, I love these guys. I love what they did. I mean, I would have had problems with that assignment. Anyone would have. So he took them in, and this was before the military was, desegregated, before they allowed black troops to serve with white troops. But General Gavin said, I'm not playing that. I'm not having it. I'm taking you under my wing. You're going to be part of my unit. And so they did a victory parade in New York City at the end of the war. And they were invited to do that. The 82nd Airborne marched down Main Street, New York City, victory parade with ticker tapes and blah, blah, blah. And Gavin said to the triple nickel, you guys are going to march with my men. You are part of my unit, and you're going to be there in that parade, and you're going to march with my men. I mean, the guy was amazing. He was so forward thinking, right? He said, this racism is just nuts, stupid. So he said, you're going to, and the triple nickel guys said, well, sir, we don't want a parade. You guys were the one. Nope, he insisted. And back to your medal question, he said, I want you to wear the same battle ribbons, the same battle medals that my men did who fought in Europe. It was not your fault. You wanted to come. And now you're under my command. So they wore the same colors, the same ribbons as everyone else. And Gavin, to this day, if you talk to anyone that was alive during Gavin's time in the triple nickel, they just sing his song. He's like the godfather of the triple nickel because he saved them. He took them in. They got the best training in the world under his command. And he said, look, if the Army had their way, they'd just leave you out there to tend for you would just suffer from abuse. And so I want you under my command. So he gave them medals, even though they didn't go overseas. Okay, do we know anything about what happened to any of these men after World War II? Yes, we do. So they served under General Gavin. Now, the good news was that Gavin took care of them. The bad news was that he decided it would be best to split them up. And there's actual stories of some of the men in the triple nickel literally crying because they were no longer going to be together as this elite, all black fighting unit, that they were going to miss their friends. They had become a very tight knit group of soldiers who had gone through a lot, and they didn't want to be separated. But Gavin thought best to do that. So he split them up. This had never happened in the military before. And it didn't happen again until the Korean War started. But anyhow, so Gavin took them in, he split them up. It was horrible. They were at least stationed nearby, so they did get to see one another, but they were no longer the all black elite unit that they once were. So another war happened. For the longest time, the United States called it a conflict, but it was in a place called Korea. And Korea to this day is divided. There's North Korea and there's South Korea. Well, the war caused that demilitarized zone to happen, that border of separation. So the US got drawn into the war in Korea. Well, once again, this was going to be a different war than we'd ever fought before as a nation. Korea is a different landscape than anywhere these men had been before. And so the military figured out that they're going to have to do something different with training. And they wanted to create special units to serve in Korea. And someone thought, let's see, what can we call these special units? We want them to be small. We want them to be specially trained to live and operate behind the enemy lines. Let's call them Rangers. So the United States military, the Army, put together this group called Rangers that were all volunteers. They had to be the best of the best. And one of the criteria was, the first criteria was you had to be airborne qualified. So they go to Fort Bragg and they say, well, we're going to create these units. We need men who are airborne qualified. And guess what happened? The triple nickel guys went, I'll go. And over 100 of these men that were in Pendleton and Walla Walla and Chico, California, out here chasing balloon bombs, ended up coming back together again and went through Ranger training and became the first Rangers in military history, called the 2nd Ranger Battalion. There's a book about them. And I loaned my book to a student and I haven't seen it since, but you can find that book and it tells you the whole story of their training. One of the last members of that group just passed away. And I have pictures of he and I together in Washington, D.C. Great person. He signed my book for me. But they became known as the 2nd Ranger Battalion. And they were all black. All of us, they were right back to where they were before. And they were sent to Korea and they made the first combat jump in Korea. So a lot of them stayed in the Army. A lot of the triple nickel guys stayed in, but a lot of them got out, of course, because their time was up. They got out after World War II because, like my father and his brother and my uncles and all of those men that I told you about before, you served in the military until the duration of the war, which means you were there until the war ended. And if it was still going on, you'd still be there. But fortunately, the war, my dad entered in 42 and all those other men, and the war was over in 45. So once the war was over, papers were processed and you were discharged out of the Army. But a lot of these triple nickel guys stayed in and they got to Fort Bragg and they were split up. They stayed in. They later became known as the 2nd Ranger Battalion, some of these guys, and they went to Korea and they were airborne troops in Korea. Now I happen to have right next to me, and I'm almost done. This is Smoke Jumper magazine. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you or not, but I'm a life member of the Triple Nickel Association, which is an association that was formed by these men right after World War II. And it's still going. We have a meeting once a year, usually in DC. And members come from all over the country. And it includes current airborne members or past military people that have a deep feeling for this particular mission and these group of men. Come from all the men and women from all over. Matter of fact, Ranger schools are now open to women. So we have more women than we've ever seen before that are airborne Rangers that show up, and they're members of the Triple Nickel Association. Matter of fact, Colin Powell is a life member of the Triple Nickel Association, General Powell. I haven't met him personally, but he usually is too busy to come to meetings. But anyhow, so I'm a life member of that organization, but I'm also a life member of the National Smoke Jumpers Association. And that shirt is over there. This is my triple nickel shirt. So I wear 2 hats. But this is the magazine of the Smoke Jumper Association. Okay, it's a quarterly magazine. Well, the reason I'm showing you this is the man on the front is a triple nickel person. This picture was taken in Pendleton, and there's his letdown rope. See it? Yeah, that's his letdown rope. He's about to board a plane. Well, this man was among the first officer corps to be assigned to the triple nickel. And his name was Clifford Allen. He was Lieutenant Clifford Allen. And he was a platoon leader, and he was sent with all the rest of them to Pendleton. And he jumped fires in Pendleton. After the war, he stayed in the Army. He went back to Fort Bragg, was a part of the 82nd Airborne, then he was assigned to different units. He ended up in Korea. I wrote this story about him because, and the title of the story that is in the magazine is titled From Pendleton to POW, which means prisoner of war. This man fought in Korea, was captured on the battlefield, and held a prisoner of war for the duration of Korea. He was liberated when the troops came through and liberated him and the other prisoners. And I have an interview with him. He died of cancer. He stayed in the military, retired a colonel, lieutenant colonel. But anyhow, I wrote this and it was published in Smoke Jumper magazine. And I was fortunate to have his picture to put on the cover of the magazine. So the men served. They continued to serve. Many of them stayed in. They continued to serve in the Army. Some even went on to Vietnam. Some of these men that are no longer with us, because I joined this group 10 years ago. Oh, longer. But anyhow, we're still alive. And some of them were not only veterans of World War II, serving out here, fighting fires, but they served in Korea and in Vietnam. So they served in 3 wars. Was Melvin Brown the only one who died? If you remember, I told you the story. He was a combat medic, and he died in Oregon. He died not very far from Pendleton on a mountain, Lemon Butte. And he was, in fact, the first smoke jumper, period. The first civilian smoke jumper, first military to die on a fire jump. And that's, again, remember I mentioned he got tangled in a tree on Lemon Butte, and he did have a letdown rope, but the rope was too short. And he landed in a tree that was over 200 feet tall. And something went horribly wrong. So yes, he was the only one. There were others with broken legs, dislocated knees. One man suffered a broken back on a landing, but he was the only fatality. He was the only one killed in action. Last question. Were the triple nickel sorry, were the triple nickels, I can't read my own writing, were the triple nickels angry or upset that they didn't get to go to Europe to fight during World War II? Did they want to go and fight? Yes. They were very disappointed. They wanted to prove, just like my father, my uncles, and all those other men I mentioned to you, the worst treatment they received was in the United States. As sad as that sounds, it's true. And they wanted to show the American people, they wanted to show our enemy that they were a tough bunch, and they were very patriotic, and they loved this country in spite of how horrible it treated them. And they wanted to prove themselves. And so when they went into the training for the triple nickel, there were bets by white troops that they would chicken out. They wouldn't jump out of an airplane. Like, seriously? Okay, just back up a minute. They always carried the weight of their race on their shoulders. And they knew that there was no room for failure. If they failed, then the military would say, see, we gave them a chance, and they didn't prove up. My father's mission unit was the same way, right? So they carried a tremendous amount of weight. All of them did, to prove that they were worthy of respect in their own country. So when they got the orders, they were so happy when they got the orders to first travel west, because they truly thought, and this is written in their documents, that they were going to Japan because they were heading west, and they thought they'd just keep on going. And they got to Pendleton and said, nope. So they were not happy. They were disappointed. They were frustrated. But you know what? Just like my father and everybody else, they said, look, this is the assignment we're given. This is the job we have been given. So let's be proud of the fact that we have this important job to do, and we have an opportunity to prove to the American people that we're just as good as anyone else. And we deserve better treatment. Our families, our children, our grandchildren. If this country's ever going to be the country that the founders wanted, okay, then just point the way. So yeah, they wanted to, and they were heartbroken when they found out that they were not going anywhere. But to a person, they said, all right, this is the mission we've been given, and we're going to do it to the best of our ability, even though they were given lousy equipment, short training, new stuff. They did it. And that's why Gavin said, you guys, man, poof, I want you under my command, because I will take what you've already created and make you even better. Um, so let's see. Yes. So that's what I have. That's what you sent, and I tried to break it down into those three categories for you, and hopefully you learn something a little bit more. I would encourage you to continue doing research on this if you're interested. I would YouTube firebombs, Japanese firebombs, World War II, if you want to know more in a lot more detail about those. I will warn you though, well, it's not really a warning. I will just say to you that in all of the research I've been doing, which I've done a lot on the balloon bombs, and I've watched a lot of documentaries, and I've watched a lot of interviews about the balloon bombs, some of them dating back into the 50s, there is not a single mention that the triple nickel had anything to do with them. Not one word. Even documentaries that are done now. There was uh, um, a what's the educational channel on PBS? There was a PBS special done on Fugos half dozen years ago, over an hour long. Goes into all kinds of details. No mention of the triple nickel. So, as my African brothers and sisters taught me during my trips there to Africa, um, to Southern Africa, and I've gone 3 times and on study experiences, teaching experiences. Here's the one, and I'm going to give it to you. And if I haven't mentioned it, I'm going to mention it now. They have a saying. Well, they have a lot of sayings, but the two that come to mind about that's related is tales of hunting will forever glorify the hunter until lions learn to write. So fortunately, lions have learned to write. And the story is slowly but surely over the years gaining some traction. And hopefully, I've made an impact, a little impact on you and your curiosity so that you know this story. Now, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to make sure that this story is in your school, that people that come behind you, your brothers and sisters, and other people in the community know this story? Now you know it. It's on you. I've just shared it with you, but what you do with it next is going to be the important part as to whether this ever makes the history books in Northwest history. Northwest history, like, well, it should be a part of Northwest history, but for now it's not. So that's what I have, and Principal Holly's give me the thumbs up. So if you have any interest to continue this conversation, your teachers have my contact information, and I'm here for you to keep you engaged in the story or any other story that I might be able to share with you that could add to your educational experience down here in Walla Walla or anywhere. So can you think of anything else? Did we cover the landscape?
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. B.
You're
I mean,
welcome.
so many
Thank you.
interesting facts that I'm so interested in the sand. And like, isn't
Yeah.
that crazy how they
Yes.
how putting that under a microscope to figure out where the bombs were coming from. So interested to hear about where the triple nickels went after they were part of World War II. I mean, just awesome. I'm so glad we were able to do this. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, well, I appreciate you inviting me back again. It's been my pleasure, and I enjoyed it very much. The opportunity to talk to you, and I would love to come down in person someday when we need to get everyone shot up, vaxxed up or whatever they're calling it these days. My wife and I have ours. We're good. Our grandkids are. Some of our grandkids, our kids, our adult children, everyone's all vaccinated. But I'd love to as I mentioned it before, Walla Walla is one of those places that I like visiting. So maybe there'll be an opportunity down the road for me actually to meet you in person and not be, although this is great, but
We'd love
it's
to
not.
have you. And the teachers have already talked about some of the other presentations that you give and wanting to invite you to come in person and be able to give some of those presentations. So I know we'll be seeing you again for sure.
Oh, awesome. I look forward to it. And love to meet the students. Yeah,
Very
great
good.
bunch.
Rogers, I'm going to say goodbye to you, but Dr. B, will you stick on for just a second?
Sure, sure.